BC, Siddhartha Gautama, or Shakyamuni Gautama of the Shakya clan, the Buddha, was born. Legend has it that he was a prince and sheltered within the palace during his early years. One day he wandered beyond the palace walls and saw a very old person, a sick person, and a corpse. That is, he saw old age, sickness, and death. And he was determined to understand such suffering. So he left his wife and young son, vowing to obtain answers to the mystery of life, suffering, and death. In one of the Pali Sutras, Palis are the earliest sutras, and sutra is essentially a teaching. It would be the equivalent of the Gospels in the Bible. In one of the Pali Sutras, talks given by the Buddha and memorized by early followers until written down, the Buddha is said to have told a story of chopping wood with his father and witnessing a bird eating a worm. At this, he became determined to understand the meaning of this world. So, in both the legend and the more probable version in the sutra, the Buddha places suffering and death at the center of his quest for wisdom. He studied in succession with two of the most renowned meditation teachers in India. But he was still unsatisfied that he had come to the deepest understanding possible. So he joined a group of forest hermits and came close to death through fasting. One day he left the forest and a little girl saw how emaciated and close to death he was, and she offered him a bowl of rice milk, which gave him the stamina to sit under the Bodhi tree for 49 days meditating. When he opened his eyes and looked up at the morning star, he experienced enlightenment. He later said he experienced all of his past lives and emerged, quote unquote, unbound. He said he experienced the unborn and the deathless. One of his forest companions saw him and could tell, just by looking at him, that the Buddha had experienced enlightenment. When he said to the Buddha, "There is so much suffering, you must teach," the Buddha responded, "No one will ever believe what I have understood." But out of deep compassion, he went on to teach for 45 years. Years after his enlightenment, when the Buddha was asked who he was, he did not claim to be a saint or a god. He said he was awake. And his answer became his title. Buddha in Sanskrit means both to wake up and to know. What he said he woke up to is a state called nirvana, a state beyond the cycle of suffering, that is samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And the word nirvana literally means extinction. And what is extinguished in the Buddhist tradition is the false self, the small self, that is the source of all craving and clinging, and therefore all misery. And the Buddha said that everyone has that capacity to wake up, to experience the kind of death that is the death of the false self, and to realize the big mind, the Buddha mind, that is always there, but that has been covered over by conditioning. And the extinction of the false self leads to a liberation that is beyond concepts or limits, and is, in the words of the Buddha, incomprehensible, indescribable, inconceivable, unutterable. Rinji, or Rinzai, the founder of the Rinzai Zen tradition, which is the Cold Mountain Sangha, we're in that tradition that practices here on retreats. Rinzai said, "There is a true person of no rank, which is always coming and going from the portals of your face." And one of the core teachings of Buddhism is emptiness. Specifically, that we are empty of a separate self. The self, the personality that identifies as I, with particular characteristics, accomplishments, possessions, and a birth date, is the small self, not the true self, the person of no rank, which is, according to the Buddha, our essential nature, our Buddha nature. Our Buddha nature is always there, already awake, already enlightened. We just don't know it because it's blocked with thoughts, opinions, notions, beliefs, frozen pockets of energy habits, which is one of the definitions of karma. And the practice of meditation is to work through all the components of this small self and to experience the great death, leaving the discriminating mind behind, entering into an emptiness which is not nothingness, but that which is one with everything. This is the deathless that the Buddha experienced, the essence that is beyond birth and death, beyond time and space, beyond the wheel of samsara or suffering, beyond the cycle of death and rebirth. The Heart Sutra, which is one of the most important sutras in Buddhism, sings of how emptiness is at the heart of the great death of the small self, and therefore the path to the deathless. It's a verbal description of the enlightened state of consciousness given by the great Bodhisattva of mercy, Avalokiteshvara, while the Buddha is sitting in deep meditation, surrounded by his disciples on Vulture Peak. And a bodhisattva is a being who has surpassed the cycle of death and rebirth. But instead of remaining in perpetual nirvana, has volunteered to return to the manifest realm in order to help alleviate suffering. Sariputra, one of the most intelligent of Buddha's disciples, asks Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of mercy, how can we attain such enlightenment? The answer Avalokiteshvara gave has been regarded, even by Lord Shakyamuni himself, as the best one possible. Sariputra, we must see the natural thusness or emptiness of all phenomena. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is not apart from form, form is not apart from emptiness. Feeling, perceiving, even consciousness itself is empty. All conditions of being are emptiness and have no characteristics. The Buddha mind is unborn and undying. It is not impure or pure. It neither grows nor shrinks. Thus, there is no form, no feeling, no sight, no thought, no eyes, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no appearance, no sound, no smell, no taste, no sensation, no ideas, nor is there any such thing as hearing well or poorly, or of being wise or stupid. There is no suffering, no cause of suffering, no ending of suffering or way to end suffering. There is no wisdom, attainment, or non-attainment. Buddhas and Bodhisattvas awaken through transcendental wisdom. Gone, 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 here fully awake. This, O Sariputra, is how we should live. But the sutra doesn't teach that all of reality is an illusion. Rather, that nothingness is also everything. The late Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, founding father of mindfulness, interprets this to mean that form is empty of a separate self, but full of everything in the cosmos. And he likes to call this interbeing, that everything is in interbeing with everything else, and everyone is in interbeing with everyone else. The centrality of the great death of the small self in emptiness does not lead to a quiescence or a spiritual bypassing that opts out of the realm of human feeling. And that's one of the misconceptions that Buddhist meditative traditions have often fallen prey to, that it seems like there is nothing that's being done, that we're just, blissed out. But on the contrary, to realize the emptiness of a separate self gives rise to compassion and a greater depth of human feeling. There's a Zen story that depicts an enlightened master crying over the death of his beloved teacher. The monks gather around him, astonished and critical. "You're an enlightened master, why are you crying?" He replied, "My teacher is no longer here, and I loved him, that's why I'm crying." There's also a story about Dongshan, an enlightened master from the 9th century, who was one of the early patriarchs of Rinzai Zen. And it goes like this. When Dongshan was unwell, a monk asked, "You are ill, teacher, but is there anyone who does not get ill?" Dongshan said unequivocally, "There is." The monk said, "Does the one who is not ill look after you?" Dongshan said, I have the opportunity to look after him. The monk said, how is it when you look after him? Dongshang said, then I don't see that he has any illness. Dongshang is obviously well acquainted with the deathless, the big mind, the Buddha mind, which, unlike the small self, is unborn and will not die. Dongshang also asked the monk, when I leave this leaking husk, where will you go to meet me? The monk had no reply. Dongshang said in verse, though the students are many, not one is enlightened. The mistake lies in pursuing the paths of others' tongues. If you want to be able to forget physical form and obliterate tracks, work hard and diligently walk in the void. And this privileges the centrality of experience, especially in the Zen traditions and in the Buddhist traditions, that it's not a matter of reading up on it or hearing what so-and-so has to say about the Buddha mind within the deathless, within the big mind. It's a matter of working inwardly. And there's also the story of Krisha Gotami, a woman who lived during the time of the Buddha and whose firstborn child died at about a year old. She was distraught and wandered the streets clutching her baby, asking everyone she saw if there was a medicine that could bring her child back to life. Eventually, someone recommended she go see the Buddha, who told her, go down to the city and bring me back a mustard seed from any house in which there has never been a death. When Krisha Gotami discovered there was no house that had not been visited by death, she buried her child and returned to the Buddha, who asked, did you bring the mustard seed? She replied, no, I am beginning to understand the lesson you are trying to teach me. Grief made me blind, and I thought that only I had suffered at the hands of death. But why have you come back? Asked the Buddha. To ask you to teach me the truth of what death is, what might lie behind and beyond death, and what, if anything, in me will not die. The Buddha began to teach her. He said, if you want to know the truth of life and death, you must reflect continuously on this. There is only one law of the universe that never changes, that all things change, and that all things are impermanent. Krisha Gotami followed the Buddha, and at the end of her life, she was enlightened. In some Buddhist tradition, meditation on death is an important practice, one that can lead to a getting off of the wheel of the cycle of death and rebirth and into nirvana. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, the ability to merge with what's called the ground of luminosity is greatly enhanced with death meditation practice, which can loosen the grip of clinging and attachment at the moment of death. As the components of this life's consciousness collapse back into what is eternal and universal, there is a short but vital opportunity to fuse with the Buddha within. Some schools of Buddhism posit a bardo state after death, an intermediate, transitional, or liminal state between death and birth. In Tibetan Buddhism, this state can last up to 49 days, but in Theravada Buddhism, the Bardo state may last only a day. In Tibetan, the word for body is lu, which means what is left behind. What we do not leave behind is our consciousness, which travels, according to this tradition, through the Bardo to a new life. The actions and deeds of our life influence our experience in the Bardos and in our new life. And karma is the momentum of energy that propels us through the Bardos to our new life. A number of Buddhist teachers also speak of the importance of Bardos in this life. Crossroads, transitional, open moments, whenever there is the death of one state of mind and the potential for the birth of another. Learning to live through uncertainty with ease, joy, compassion, and curiosity, rather than fear, will both prepare us for the Bardo state after death, as well as invite us to live more fully, moment to moment, in this life. The Buddhist path, while adhering to the belief in rebirth, is focused on the miracle of the life we lead and on bringing the timeless, deathless self that is who we really are into our way of being in the world. Buddhist teaching includes this concept of intentional action. Buddhists hope to either gain enlightenment or to ensure a better future for themselves through good actions, such as ethical conduct, and by developing concentration and wisdom. In one of his earliest talks, the Buddha said that his teachings are centered on suffering and on the way to end suffering. In the Zen source book, Traditional Documents from China, Korea, and Japan, the writers use a medical metaphor to articulate the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught. The first noble truth, that there is suffering, is the diagnosis. This is an observation, not a condemnation or prediction. People get sick, age, and die. The second noble truth explains the cause of the problem. Desire resulting from ignorance of the ultimate nature of reality, which is impermanent and interconnected. In other words, suffering occurs when a person becomes attached to things that cannot create happiness, or rejects things out of fear that they will create unhappiness. Decisions and actions made on the basis of the three poisons of delusion, greed, and aversion will inevitably result in suffering. But the prognosis could not be better. There is a cure. According to the third noble truth, it is possible to cease suffering. Delusion, greed, and aversion can be extinguished. The treatment plan, or the prescription, lies in the fourth noble truth, which outlines what's called the Eightfold Path. And these are 8 guidelines to live in accordance with. So the Eightfold Noble Path, sometimes each one of these guidelines is called right, sometimes it's called upright, depending on the translation. Right understanding, right thought, right speech. And there's an example of right speech, that before speaking, look 7 generations ahead and discern what the outcome of what you're going to say might be. And there are 5 things to kind of check off before you open your mouth, basically. So, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it honest? Is it necessary? That was one more. True, honest, helpful, necessary. I'll think of the 5th one. It's obviously one I need to work on. Is it helpful? It'll come. All right. Right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So these 8 factors aim at promoting and perfecting the 3 essentials of Buddhist training and discipline, namely ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom. And ethical conduct is built on the vast conception of universal love and compassion for all beings, on which the Buddhist teaching is based. Combined with mindfulness and concentration, bodhicitta, the Sanskrit word for awakened mind, compassionate wisdom is achieved. So when the small self, which is just a combination of all our energy habits that have temporarily been sticking together, comes apart, that appears to us to be a death. But our true nature, the Buddha mind, is deathless. When the Buddha lay dying surrounded by 500 of his disciples, he said to them, "It is in the nature of all things that take form to dissolve again. Strive with all your being to attain perfection." So are there any questions?